If your focus was focused on the kinds of questions that people say they're experiencing with FLFE, what would the world be like if people could be more forgiving of each other? How would the world be like if people could be able to change from negative to positive and be happy, having that capability, that opportunity to switch from negative perceptions to ones that are positive and that have positive consequences? How would the world change if people sought having an increased peaceful life? How would the world change if people were not just thinking about themselves?
Hey, Inspire Tribe, my fellow freedom lovers, John Nolan here. Thank you so much for tuning in to another truly inspired conversation today. It's such an honor. Today's guest, his work has helped redefine the boundaries of science and consciousness. Dr. Gary Schwartz is professor emeritus at psychology at the University of Arizona, of psychology, where he also held appointments in medicine, neurology, psychiatry, and surgery. He's a pioneer in bridging the worlds of academic research and spiritual inquiry with over 500 scientific publications and a career dedicated to exploring the deeper nature of reality. Dr. Schwartz has spent decades investigating energy healing, consciousness fields, and the communication beyond the veil. He's published groundbreaking books like The Afterlife Experiments, The Energy Healing Experiments, and the one that I'm reading right now, Extraordinary Claims Require Extraordinary Evidence. What sets Dr. Schwartz apart is his unwavering commitment to scientific integrity while exploring phenomena that many still consider fringe. He's now applying his expertise to cutting-edge research on how subtle energy influences human health, plant vitality, and even water, opening new doors for how we might understand and interact with the world around us. It's a wonderful opportunity to speak with someone who brings both heart and data to the conversation on human evolution. So please welcome with me Dr. Gary Schwartz. It's a pleasure to have you, Doc.
It's a pleasure for me to be here. And I must say that I'm a bit embarrassed by your beautiful introduction.
Oh, I have to tell you, every single bio that I've read of you is so comprehensive and so dense with incredible accomplishments that, to put it on one page was sort of its own little task that I was sitting at, for days. And what is important to me is actually going to turn into my first question. Doc, what is it beyond the calls and the emails and the schedules? What is it that brought you and me together today?
Wow. It depends whether you want the mechanics of what happens in the physical world, or you want to open yourself up to the possibility that there may have been more complex forces at work, including.
I'll go with number two, sir.
I had a feeling that you might. First of all, my connection, my even coming to learn about FLFE and then to become inspired by it and then was able to join the organization was very, quote, coincidental. I mean, what are the odds that at a university in the Office of Technology Transfer, there's an individual who is not only technology advanced and software advanced and business advanced, but he also has a pretty, probably mostly secret kind of deep spiritual side. And he ended up being at the University of Arizona when I'm doing this work, for example, in what we call the soul phone, applying technology, state-of-the-art technology to detect the energy and information, and therefore the consciousness of people who have left their physical bodies. We call them post-material people.
PMPs?
Yeah, we call them PMPs. Post-material persons or post-material participants in his research. And that he would be the person that I would end up dealing with at the technology level in order to represent the potential technological and also commercial implications of the work we're doing. So the probability that there would be somebody even like that at the university was unusual. But then he had been secretly involved with FLFE through learning about it, trying the free 15-day trial, having deep experiences with it, deciding to get the service and put it on his house. He then decided that they could use someone like him with his skills in technology and technology transfer, and that he knew someone that might be able to help them. So it was through him that I became to meet Clayton and Jeffrey, who of course you know, and then others in that community. And the overlap, the discovery that our higher values were so in sync, and that their purposes, their express purposes, which I didn't even know you could ever find in a business, would be available to me, and that I might be able to make some small contribution to their mission. And we spent probably a good year to 2 years just having discussions and about philosophy and science and humanity and greater spirituality before we made the decision that I should become an advisor for them in their research. So already there was this circumstance of what are the odds, and that it felt like I was in training, had been in training for years, to have the kind of skills and background that would contribute to both the credibility and the vision of what they were committed to doing. But how do you become involved with this? Okay. And it's not just you, because I know you and people know this about you, but of all the people, other than Meredith, who who I was interviewed with by 20 years ago, and then we reconnected with FLFE, you are the first person that has actively sought to interview me related to FLFE, because I've tried to keep a low visibility as I was preparing to quote retire from the university, partly because this work is so controversial. But of all the people that I would get the privilege to share my experience and background with, you're just like, I could not have invented you. I could not have imagined someone with your history and your background and your interests and your values, that I would have the privilege to meet and then have this kind of conversation, including the fact that, as you know, when I looked up your bio and discovered that you had spent part of your time in Rockville Center, Long Island.
No, actually, that wasn't me, but the second part was correct, was the music part, that I have a huge background in country music and songwriting. That part wasn't correct, but the rest is correct. The rest is all there.
How did I get that mixed up?
It was during our first interaction that we have back and forth. But what you so beautifully, eloquently, the threat that you showed, um, is leading to one possible explanation, and that is something that is very important in your work and your discoveries, which is the concept of synchronicities, right? And in all of this, we can all feel, all of us that are connected in this communication, like you just mentioned, the founders of FLFE, the wonderful people that work with them, your team, our team, there is a threat that shows up, and it is connecting things in an effortless way, and it is making things happen that shouldn't happen that easily, and it is making something very clear that it is meant to be, so to speak. And that is, this big concept of synchronicity, which a lot of people speak about, but you're a scientist, right? You are, I mean, you look at the data, and you shouldn't be, as a scientist, someone who uses such a word lightly. So, as a scientist, what does that mean to you, synchronicity?
Good question. I'll give you an example. You want to guess how many podcast interviews and what you uh, Zoom calls or whatever I've had in my life?
I
Hundreds, of course.
I can't imagine, but I will ask this before you get into this. There's one episode that was before YouTube, before the internet, where you appeared on a very famous show with some very famous people, and that one stuck out to me. So just so people know that you've been doing this for a year or two, what was that appearance?
Are you talking about the John Lennon Yoko Ono
Yes, sir.
television show?
You actually appeared with John Lennon and Yoko Ono on what was a podcast back in the day.
Right. Which was quite magical because I have as you know, a background in music like you do, and
That's
I
incredible.
so admire your music. Okay, so how many times do you think I have sat and looked at a person, and behind the person, right next to their head, is a gigantic horse, a beautiful horse? How many times do you think I've had that?
It's hard to tell, but I wouldn't say not that often.
You want to guess once? Because I pay attention to these kinds of things. I
So
don't think in all of my time, in all of my interviews and conversations, I've ever seen someone with a big horse behind his head. Okay, what you don't know is I have a very similar horse in what was my university office at my laboratory at the university, which is now we've now moved it. And if you look behind my head, you'll notice that there is a large horse head. The horse is very meaningful to me. So I'm seeing my horse and your horse. Now, what are the statistical odds? So let me ask the question: how many times have you seen somebody with a big horse behind their head?
I don't think I can't recall a single time.
Right. So therefore, if we were to calculate what's called the conditional probability, the probability of two people having meaningful horses, and I don't know why you have this horse behind you, but I suspect
It
it's
is very
meaningful.
meaningful. It is very meaningful.
That's
Yes.
my intuition, and you can guess this horse is very meaningful to me. What's the probability of this occurring by chance? It's probably at least 1 in a million by chance. That's my guess.
Hmm.
Guesstimate. It's probably even less than that. And you ask me, how do I define synchronicity or quote a meaningful coincidence? A prerequisite, because I'm a quote boring scientist, a prerequisite is that the probability of its occurrence has to be so improbable that you begin to wonder whether non-random processes were playing a role in putting the information together. You infer the existence of some sort of a non-random coordinating higher power collective processing, because otherwise by randomness it wouldn't appear. And that's a basics in particularly in, for example, psychological science. We do statistics all the time, and the way that we reach a conclusion that something is probably not random is when the probability of occurring by chance is so sufficiently strong that you can reject the quote null hypothesis or the non-randomness. So for me, a synchronicity as a scientist is not just an event that is meaningful and that strikes you as unusual, but it's so unusual that it's you sort of, if you have any credibility at all and any integrity at all, you're going to step back and say, gee, I wonder if this is meaningful. I wonder if something is going on and that I should pay attention to this.
So when you describe this, it implies that something connects everyone and everything, that there is something. And people call that the field. Some people refer to it as, God and all of his expressions. And others call it consciousness, which we talk about a lot, but we have very few palpable definitions. When we talk about synchronicity, and you define it beautifully, what is consciousness?
Well, there is again, I go back to basics. There are the things that we quote all know that we shouldn't lose, and then there are the more deeper and conceptual concepts. For me, the least that consciousness is what we call experience, and it's awareness. So it is a perception and an experience that individuals have, and you know it when you have it, and it's foundational to everything that we do. When we're quote unconscious, we know we're not aware of the environment, and when we are quote conscious, we know that we are aware. And although yes, we can become much more sophisticated in that definition, but the least that it is, it's our awareness. And therefore, to the extent we can expand our awareness, both in depth and breadth, both of the physical world and of things which are not, quote, clearly observed with our physical senses, we are, quote, expanding our consciousness, where the least consciousness means is awareness and experience. Now, you could say, all right, how is consciousness and awareness related to either the consciousness of a synchronicity or the actual occurrence of a synchronicity? And that, of course, gets to really deep questions about to what extent is our consciousness play a role in the synchronicities that occur? Our consciousness play a role. And how much of it is beyond our consciousness and involves the consciousness and intention of things which are bigger than us, more sophisticated than us, what we call higher consciousness, and so on. That's why I have this, what as a boring scientist convinced me that synchronicity was real, was that I ended up, starting when I was a professor at Yale, experiencing what are technically called serial coincidences, meaning complex sequences of events where it's not just two. We're having a pair of horses right now. I call it a type 1 synchronicity. But what would happen if we discovered that we had 2 or 3 more horses that were going on simultaneously? I would call that a type 2 synchronicity. And then what I classify as a type 3 synchronicity is when 6 or more events in close proximity all lay out, and the probability of this constellation occurring by chance becomes so infinitesimal that you end up you're forced to the conclusion that something very intelligent and with great foresight is coordinating the process. And that high level of intelligence is producing what I call a super synchronicity. And I've tracked super synchronicities since I was at Yale. And then I wrote a book, trying to remember when it was published. I think it was 2021, I'm not exactly sure of the date, called Super Synchronicity, Where Science and Spirit Meet, where I lay out many examples of these streams or strings of highly improbable event, where each event then becomes that much more improbable related to all the other events. And you end up your jaw drops. You end up you're living in a state of wonder, in a state of quote disbelief, in a state of awe, in a state of gratitude, appreciation. You end up realizing this, in order to make sense of all this, that you and maybe some of your fellow conscious beings don't have either the intelligence or the power to be able to put all that together in this way. And I see that as probably some of the best empirical evidence for the existence of some sort of an infinite mind with infinite intelligence. And we can call that God, we can call that the one mind, we can call that divinity.
Now, I gotta ask you, Doc, you've been uh, researching this, talking about this, writing about this for decades. And, what you just described, your everyday person would say, well, those are clear signs, either signs by God or signs of the universe. And people, they're sort of thankful for that because they sort of get a confirmation I should do something or shouldn't do something. This is all, and it's all sort of in a spiritual, religious, metaphysical sense, but okay, it's a sign, good. But what did your peers say over the years and over the decades that you would take such a woo woo concept and actually put an extraordinary amount of time and scientific research into proving its existence? Like I'm sure you must have been met with some skepticism, to say the least.
Yes. I, first of all, in the area of synchronicity, I did it with my left hand on the side.
Okay.
So, although I did publish articles in journals, for example, the American Psychological Association has a journal called Spirituality and Clinical Practice, and I did publish 3 articles about the question of supersynchronicity and inferring a God process. However, for the most part, to my mainstream people in medicine and in psychology, I didn't talk about it. I didn't share it. The and part of the reason is because a person who's not prepared to see this and to see the implications of what it means, often people feel very uncomfortable. And it's very important for me, especially when I was formally in the university and I was trying to do mainstream science in the bridge between science and spirituality, particularly with the technology work and the life after death work, where I had to focus on the things that my colleagues could understand and emphasize those. I mean, I can't remember ever giving a talk in the psychology department about synchronicity. I can't remember ever having even a conversation with any of my colleagues about synchronicity. It was something that was partly also because it's sacred. And so in order to honor the process and be able to allow the process to occur and not try to force it on people or I just did it, quote, quietly. Not so quietly that I didn't publish books. Not so quietly that I didn't speak to certain communities who were craving to have, collected data where you can really talk about the statistical improbability of the events occurring and how do we draw meaning from to what extent, if this is a communication, what am I supposed to do with it? Those deep questions that you were asking. But with my colleagues, um, what's the expression? I don't even want to use this, but there's certain quote battles that is wise not to, or fights not to.
Pick your battles, right? Pick your
Yes,
battles wisely.
yes, and I hope that that's what I've done. So go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that also we have to always consider when we look at the past, both context and perspective are required. It's 2025 and maybe even within the mainstream of some things have changed. But let's turn the page back to 1975. was a completely different environment, so context and perspective matter, and we can't say as observers today, we know we would have done it differently. We don't, it's so I trust the process, in other words. But you mentioned something. You said that these subjects have deep meaning to a lot of people: consciousness, synchronicities, and consciousness not just in this life, but beyond the end of the human body. And specifically when people experience a loss of a loved one, then the signs, the consciousness, the synchronicities become that much more important, and they're looking for them. And it is sort of the evidence that we're looking for, even those who believe very, very deeply that life does not end with the body. Now, as a scientist, again, you have taken this to a whole new level, and you've mentioned this earlier. You're working on a technology called the soul phone, and actually hard to imagine, but you're beyond the burden of proof stage. So, can you talk a little bit about that and what prompted that?
Okay. Well, what prompted it were multiple factors. Some of the factors were that prior to that, my work in survival of consciousness, like many of the things that I've done, you probably can sense that in the Extraordinary Claims book, a lot of it was, quote, coincidence or chance. Things were brought to me, opportunities came to me, and they were coincidental. And it became I would say almost, I felt an obligation to both certain individuals and also to knowledge to see whether these things were real or not. And this was the claim that mediums, that people who claimed to be able to speak to the deceased, were they really all frauds? Were they really all engaged in cold reading, the kinds of things that the skeptic assumes must be true? Or were there at least some mediums who were real? They were literally getting information from individuals who had died, and that information could not be explained by either trickery or simple paranormal explanations, such as the medium was reading the mind of the sitter, i.e. the person who's grieving their loved one. And I did a whole series of experiments, and I was forced by the totality of the evidence to conclude that there's a real phenomenon here. There's no question that the simple skeptical explanation, it's all fraud, it's all cold reading, it's all simple mind reading, from a paranormal explanation, that none of those explanations could account for all of the data. So there was something real going on. So why didn't I just stay with mediumship? Well, there were multiple reasons. Part of the reason is that some mediums may be very accurate, but many are not. Number two, there will ever be enough mediums to be able to enable people to connect with their loved ones if it's going to become a widespread thing. And third, if technology could detect the energy and information and intention, and it could do so more accurately, it could be something that would then both convince people that this was real and would give them the opportunity to connect with those who had departed, which includes people who have transitioned, but what we call wisdom keepers, or the wise individuals, the wisest of people who have been on this planet and who still care about the health of the planet, the health of our species, and so on. So that was part of it. Part of it was if technology could do this, there were many advantages for doing it. The other part was that I started out as an electrical engineer. I played electric guitar. I worked with technology. My PhD was in psychophysiology, the relationship between the mind and body, and I would record electrical signals from the body and measure people's emotional reactions and so on. So I had a natural background and I had background in physics, so it was a natural background for me to take this knowledge and experience and couple it with my interest in the survival of consciousness area, and that's what then I think started me on the process.
So I'm curious. Is this when we think about a soul phone? And I mean, literally, people probably imagine, hey, I pick up a phone just like I would a phone, and I call my dead grandfather. Is how can we imagine the very process of doing this?
Okay. Well, first of all, we could ask the question: why did I pick the word soul phone?
What's a brilliant combination of words, exactly describing to me what this is.
Well, I did it for multiple reasons, including the fact that it's also easy to say soul phone. It's poetic. It also is the soul. I played soul music,
Hmm.
and it's a musician part of me, so it was honoring that. But the other thing was that the goal is to be able to use state of the art sensors and state of the art information processing in computers, like and now potentially with the advantage of AI for detecting signal and noise. But the goal is to be able, the ultimate goal is to be able to both see your loved one and hear your loved one. So, in the same way that we have an app that might connect to the cloud, that might connect to some hardware, and our phone is merely just a tool to connect to that app that then, in the cloud.
But just to be clear, Doc, sorry to interrupt. We're not talking about a simulated projection as so many AI concepts actually go about. We're talking about what is actually visible as it appears.
We are talking about literally measuring the energy and information of PMPs that will be in a special space working with special sensors that will detect their presence both visually and auditorily. So literally the PMP is the equivalent of a sound studio. In fact, when we first started doing this work 12 years ago, and we took a year off and did it privately, we called it Soul Studios, because the idea of a recording studio is a closer analogy to the process. So the PMP is in a special room with special equipment, and this equipment is detecting their energy and information. Okay, that's the long-term goal. The short-term goal, the simplest goal, is to create a simple binary switch so that a PMP can press in our physical world, touch something. I know you have to say, what, you're gonna tell me that a PMP comes and has hands and they can
Just
take
as a
their
reminder,
hands,
that is a post-material person.
a post-material person comes to a laboratory in their full historical system form. They have
Hmm.
arms, they have legs, they have their clothing that they've worn. They may be wearing jewelry that they wore that they particularly liked when they were on the earth. They are there in what appears to be their historical form, which is why mediums, particularly mediums who can see, can recognize them because they see them. They see their face, they see their hair, they see their clothing, and so on. Those PMPs can then, in response to specific questions that a computer will give, will then make a response on a particular sensor. At one point in the work, we were using amplifiers that measured femtoamps, and
I have no idea what that is.
a femtoamp is, I think, the millionth of a billionth of an amp. I mean, we're talking about infinitesimally tiny signals in a sea of noise. And the goal is to be able to have a detection where when they press that key, not the key, but when they make that response, they interact with the sensor, the accuracy of the equipment detecting whether they made that movement or not is in the high 90%. So we set the bar very high. If we just get 60% or 70%, well, we know it's statistical proof that they're there, but it's not a practical device. So we're looking for 99%, 98%. Okay, so now let's imagine that a PMP can make a movement and it can be detected, a binary event. If you have one binary event that you can detect, what happens instead, if you have 40 of those sensors, you can now arrange them as a keyboard. And if there are 40 sensors and they can put their hands in the particular key, they can now send text messages.
Holy moly.
And now we have PMP texting. So although PMP texting isn't going to have the same level of emotional feeling and meaning as being able to see your loved one and hear them, but it's definitive proof because you can ask the kinds of questions and do the kinds of things that can give you assurance that is your particular person that you're dealing with.
Incredible.
And if they can do that, everything changes. Because now they can interact with computers just like we can. They could, in principle, submit patents if the government would accept it from them. But they could literally do the kinds of writing and get the information into the place that needs to be. Once you,
sorry, go ahead, sir. Go ahead, sir.
No,
please.
go ahead. Sure.
Specifically to that, because it's such a timely subject, I just wanted to throw a question in here. With the advent of sophisticated AI large language models, these chat bots or chat partners, if you will, that people talk to on a very sophisticated level, there has been, and there are theories out there that say that this kind of neural network that is created might give consciousness from other dimensions the possibility to speak through that the medium of that technology. I'm not saying that the two are related, what you speak about, but have you ever even remotely looked at that possibility and whether that is perhaps in other ways already happening, maybe unbeknownst to us?
The answer is for practical reasons, no, because we're focusing on something that we could potentially achieve and know one way or another that we could have a definitive outcome in the next couple of years. With AI, particularly that kind of controversial question, the first thing we would need to do, and somebody would need to do this who would be an AI expert, is that you would have to start running an interchange where now what's coming through the natural language processing is some communication that claims to be your loved one. Now, the beauty of how do we know whether it's really AI or not? I mean, how do we know whether the AI is creating the story or whether or not it's really your loved one? And this is where private knowledge becomes really important. So if you did something, I don't know, you have children, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. May I ask how old they are?
22, 24, and 26.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, I find that hard to believe. That's okay. I can accept maybe 6, 8, and 10, but no. There are probably experiences that you had with each of your children that no one else will know except you and your kids.
For sure.
And there's no way that that an AI system searching the entire web could gain that information. So now let's imagine one of your children unfortunately passes.
Let's take me, Doc. Let's take me. Let's put them on the other end of the AI. Let's take me here.
All right. You pass. They want to know whether through the AI system, whether you have found a way to use the AI system, that technology, to communicate your information through them. What can they do? They came to me and said, Gary, how am I going to know it's my dad or not? I'd say, okay, let's make a list and don't put it anywhere that anybody can see it, of experiences that you had with your dad, things that you know about your dad that nobody else would know. Things that happened between the two of you, maybe favorite moments or whatever. And now connect with your dad with the AI, ask him the questions, and see what he says. And if it's really you and you were coming through a medium, if it was really you and you were using our soul switch, we call it a soul switch, you get the right answer. The AI is not going to be able to get the answer.
I agree. Now with your soul phone, I mean, you've said to me in a different conversation that this is, far beyond the proof of concept. What do you think is a realistic timeline until people can actually, everyday people can use such a soul phone? We're not going to hold you to it. We're talking ballpark.
Okay. Let's first of all limit soul phone to soul texting, meaning we're talking about a soul switch. So we have a binary switch that is now accurate to where we can tell whether a PMP has pressed that switch or not, at least 97% of the time, so we can then know that it's a correct response or not. I would say, based on all of the data that we currently have, I'm shooting for within, I know it sounds a little extraordinary, but I am shooting for within the next 2 years.
Extraordinary.
It is extraordinary. And I say this based on all the data that we've collected. I can also indicate what are all the ifs, what are the things that need to be resolved in that in order for that to happen. I mean, I wouldn't do that here, but the answer is that in principle, it's that level is feasible. Whether we reach it or not, I don't know. All I can say is that we're doing everything that we can to give the PMPs the opportunity to be able to work with us to manifest this possibility.
Well, it's an extraordinary project that I think will catch a lot of people's attention just hearing about such an idea, let alone it already being pretty far developed. Now, Doc, I would like to turn the page to an equally extraordinary technology that you've made a choice that doesn't happen very often in academia, and to make such a commitment, you have accepted the position of director of research for FLFE, focused life force energy. And knowing, reading your book and knowing what your process is to measure, discover, and confirm the truth of something, you have a high burden there in order to say this is the truth. So when we talk about the beginnings of your journey with FLFE, you went about it the scientific way. I think it's an extraordinary story. Can you share a little bit, because you did not go on the service for a long time?
No, I
So
didn't.
how were those beginnings for you?
Okay. First of all, even though I'm doing obviously this work, for example, with mediumship and now with technology, and I'm standing up for it, that's because of years of research data. I always start, as you know by reading the Extraordinary Claims book, that I start as an open-minded, open-hearted skeptic. One of my writing partners 12 years ago, he said, Gary, what you are is an orthodox agnostic. So my response to any question is there gravity or is there God? My response is, I don't know, could be yes, could be no. Show me the data. I'm open. So I try to start with a question of not having an opinion or prejudice one way or another. it's not that I don't have opinions about whether I would like certain things to be true or not. I
We
mean,
all
obviously,
do.
I don't want to work on things that I don't want to be true, or I
Hmm.
think that might hurt humanity. So I want to put my energy into things that I quote hope are true and I think might be good for humanity. But my job as a scientist is not to make the universe the way I'd like it to be, but it's to help us understand the way the universe really is. And and Clayton said something very interesting to me. He said, he said, you have a reverence for the scientific method, a reverence for the humans learning how to more effectively understand what's real and what's not, and protecting that. And it's true. I'm romantic about that. Okay.
Well, it's good. I like that. This is it's a there's love involved here. Love for the truth, love for the process, love for every step of it.
Yes. And it's because I know, based on many of the videos that I've watched of yours, that you come from that, you appreciate that. Something, it takes one to know one sometimes. Okay. So when I approached with FLFE, what I explained to them was like that often I approach particularly things that are extraordinary. And the metaphor that I use is I'm like a blind man studying color vision. And what do I mean by that? Well, a blind man obviously can't see. So if he's going to study color vision, first of all, he has to study people who can see and give them the benefit of the doubt that what they're seeing is accurate until you find reason to question it. And that's one of the things you do methodology with. Okay. The downside, of course, of being blind is that you're limited in what you can see. The upside, though, is more often than not, you will end up asking certain questions that a person could see would never think to ask because they do see. So it's so, quote, obvious to them, they don't realize that there's something there that is more meaningful than they're simply thinking about. Okay. FLFE makes probably as great a collection of extraordinary claims of any company that I've ever had the privilege to know about or advise. The difference with FLFE is that they're totally committed to wanting to know what's real, and they were it's they're such truth seekers, and they're so committed to both of knowing things numerically that when I came along with this particular philosophy, which ultimately they turned into what they call the gold standard for FLFE research, it was because they resonated with the same meta scientific / spiritual goals of truth seeking. And that made me feel more comfortable to then say, okay, let's look at what some of your claims are, and let's see what kind of data we could obtain, that we could collect initially from your own customers, that would either confirm or disconfirm some of your claims. And some things that the quote low hanging fruit can still be delicious, and you wouldn't want to ignore the fruit. Quite the contrary, you'd want to savor it. So in the case of FLFE, getting back to consciousness, their theory is that they're dealing with consciousness, and that they are enhancing and raising consciousness in particular areas, and that people's consciousness, to various degrees, is being elevated, is being improved by them living in a space that has more of the prevalence of these high consciousness fields. And so what I first encouraged them to do was to start with tracking more objectively, but what are the experiences that people spontaneously report having when they're on FLFE? And let's determine empirically, what's the percentage of time that people say when they're on FLFE, they notice, for example, that it's easier for them to shift their thinking from negative to positive thinking.
It's true. I'm one of those, yes.
Okay.
Claims that.
Or that they find it's easier for them to be more forgiving. Again, not everybody reports this, but the question was, what percentage of people report this? Or I feel more peaceful when I'm, in the space. And they had a whole set of spontaneous reports that people would make and share about their experiences. And so the very first question one would therefore ask is, well, what is the prevalence of these experiences? How common are they? Do people really report them more than you'd expect to occur by chance? And can you show that the presence of the field is associated with the increase in those reports? Now, something else that FLFE realizes, partly because they're practical and partly because they are conceptual, they realize that when you first start knowing whether a service that you're providing works or not, the least you do is to find out whether the people who are on the service report having positive benefits. Okay. That's the least you do. Because if your own customers don't report positive results, then what are you doing this for? Now, the skeptic, be the skeptic motivated because they just don't believe that FLFE is possible, or they're skeptical just because they know the method is incomplete that you've done, which is true. If a person says, well, somebody tries a service for 15 days and they spontaneously notice that they're having certain spontaneous experiences, their family members are having certain experiences, and so on. And then they decide to go on the service. And then they keep, noticing it just as a family, not as a formal data collection. How do you know this is not, quote, simply a placebo effect? Because they are trying the service with the hope that it's going to work. Why would you try something that you're hoping is going to improve your consciousness if you're not open to the possibility that it's actually going to improve your consciousness? So therefore, if you're going to do this, then you're going to be open to the idea that your consciousness may improve, that the things that you were seeking, whether it was sleeping better or being less stressed or having more energy or whatever the particular variables were, be they more physical or be they more spiritual, are what you're seeking. If you then get positive results, the skeptic can argue and say, well, how do you know it's not all a placebo effect? It's all belief. How do you know whether or not the FLFE is actually doing something? That question in science is called, and particularly in clinical science, is called a phase 2 study. A phase 1 study is when you document as a phenomena, when people participate in something and you get an effect. So it tells you something is happening. It's proof that something's happening. But the second question you then want to ask is, what's happening? How do we know that it's actually, for example, involving FLFE? And that's where you get to the notion of what are called, for example, double-blind experiments. Okay. So, but you're not going to do double-blind experiments until you've done single-blind experiments. Because if you don't have a large body of data to know that there's something major going on, why would you then want to try to do some sort of crazy experiment? And I say crazy. Why? Because how many people sign up for something and say, okay, I'm going to sign up for it, maybe even pay money for it, but it's okay if you don't tell me whether I get it or not. No.
Yeah.
That doesn't happen. If that doesn't happen, when you sign up, you want to know. So when you create a blinded study, you do not engage in the process that people are actually using it. That's why you want to know what's going on in the non-blinded before you do the blinded. However, and this is so cool, however, if you collect a large amount of data, and we did multiple studies up to the point where we did it, and the one that we, primary one that's reported on the website, where we had 338 or some large number like that of participants. One of the questions we asked was, to what extent did the effects meet your expectations? Some people said, yes, it's what I expected. Some people said, it's less than I expected. Some people said, it's more than I expected. Now, the more than you expected is an anti-placebo effect. Okay? Much to my amazement, remember, I'm a data guy. So for me, becoming ever more committed to FLFE was driven by the supportive evidence, not just the openness and the philosophy and the vision of the founders and so on. That was a necessary but not sufficient condition. It had to eventually lead to the discovery of data that would lead us to a firmer conclusion about whether FLFE is real. Because you don't want to try to figure out how something works until you know that it does work. In that research, 2/3 of the people reported that the effects of FLFE were greater than they anticipated. 2/3 of the people who signed up for it were surprised. And their experiences across the board showed the greatest effects in terms of their perception of improvement in these fundamental items that we culled. Now you look at those kind of data and you say, wow, that's really interesting. So if you'll let me just do one other thing, we'll stop here. As beautiful as such data are, and we are following this up now with blinded studies, as beautiful, as encouraging as those data are, why am I so enthusiastic? Why? Because in parallel, FLFE did experiments that didn't require a person giving their feelings or their consciousness. How did they do that? They worked with organisms where it's very difficult to get self-report answers, and also to get their approval to participate in the research. They looked at the effects of FLFE on plants. And they were able to do double-blind experiments in the conduct of the research and in the scoring of the data. So that if positive FLFE effects were observed in rates of germination or the length of the roots that grew at a particular stage in the experiment, you couldn't claim it was a placebo effect. The plants were blind to what the experiment were and what group they were in. The person who ran the experiment and then scored the data was blind to which group was which. So the findings that you get from those experiments, presuming, of course, they replicate, which is always the case in science, they're definitive. So if you know that plants can show an FLFE effect, then you should be open to the possibility that the human effects are probably more than a placebo effect. It's not that our consciousness can't influence the degree to which we experience a positive result or not, whether we're open to it, whether we're appreciative of it. There are various factors which may determine the extent to which the experience takes root in us or not. No pun intended. I didn't mean to mix metaphors or experiments, but it's not a bad metaphor, actually. So it was that combination of two sets of data that finally led me to say, this is too important, because if it's real, it's one of the most important, has been one of the most important implications for the evolution of humanity. Our understanding of consciousness, our understanding of health and healing, the capacity of us to interact, to work with technology and with a greater mind to be able to promote growth and health and well-being, not just for us, but for the whole planet. And yeah, that's an extraordinary set of ideas.
You know, and in the years now, in almost 2 years that we have worked with FLFE, the just how extraordinary the entire operation is becoming more and more evident every day. And the beautiful thing of our entry point was that it was in a different way, also very synchronistic. First off, we had a need. We were both, my wife and I, very sensitive to the ramp up of EMFs around us, and we could feel the effects, the fatigue, all the symptoms. So that we had a desire, and we had put it out in the universe that we needed some sort of relief from that. And when an email came from Monica, who works with FLFE, who's a wonderful, wonderful communicator for the company, when her email came to us, and also a viewer of Inspired, the beautiful thing was, considering all circumstances, that we were extremely busy at the time. We were working on a new platform. I was basically 16, 17 hours. My wife and I were tuned into that. She had read the email. I'd never read it. Now you have to know about me. I'm to a fault an anti-tech guy. So when somebody talks about a technology, it's almost like, "Ugh." And when it has to do with healing, and I'm very, very skeptical, extremely. So all my wife said is, there's this interesting email, and I didn't hear really any of the rest much. All she said is, I have a good feeling about this intuitively, and I trust my wife's intuition. She has impeccable intuition. And she said, they give us a try. Do you want to do the trial? And since I trust her, but had no idea what I was trying, I just said, yes, let's do it. Forgot about it almost the next second. And then had these experiences over the next days. Much more energy. I went to the gym a couple days later and worked out for 2 hours, which I hadn't done in years. I just felt like switched on. I slept better. And after 2 days, it became, or 3 days, it became so evident that we had a conversation about it. It was like, something's going on, not making any connection whatsoever, just saying something's going on here. We're sleeping better. We're feeling better. Something is happening. And then my wife said, oh my God, it must be that FL whatever thing that they. So that's when we went back and really started paying attention, researching, looking at the website, all of the stuff. So in my personal case, it was clearly not a placebo, because I didn't have any expectations, because I didn't even know what the service was. I had no idea. So I'm one of those. And then what really made this so much sweeter is that the level of consciousness in everyone involved, and the intention and the execution is on such a high level that I have started calling FLFE one of the most important services in the world today. And I truly believe that. Like, I'm not saying this lightheartedly. I do think that this is, for the time that we find ourselves in, it's so significant it can't even be overstated. Now, that is a claim, and we're going into theorizing here, Doc, but let's just say that our message and the message of FLFE makes it farther out into the world, and more people use and experience the service. What are the potential implications? Because I know you've thought about this. What would be the implications if, let's say, half of the population lives in a high consciousness field? What do you think could potentially change and let's stay very conservative. What could change?
Wow. I know you ask good questions. I know you ask big questions. It's okay to put a person like me on the spot. Uh,
I apologize. I apologize. But
and I will forgive you because there's a whole beautiful horse sitting over your shoulder. Okay.
I have to take
Yeah,
this
yeah,
opportunity to
yeah,
pick your brain, Doc. I
yeah,
have to.
yeah.
It's my job.
Well, okay. Let's take your premise that half of the world's population decides that they would like to make a choice
Choice.
to live a healthier, more high consciousness life for themselves, for their children, for their most immediate family, and also for their sense of contributing something to the greater good. Because they know it's not just for them. When they make this choice, their children are experiencing this choice. You're ending up role modeling something for your children, your neighbors, and so on. How could humanity change if your focus was focused on the kinds of questions that people say they're experiencing with FLFE? What would the world be like if people could be more forgiving of each other? How would the world be like if people could be able to change from negative to positive and be happy with that, having that capability, that opportunity to switch from negative perceptions to ones that are positive and have positive consequences? How would the world change if people sought having an increased peaceful life? How would the world change if people were not just thinking about themselves, but they were thinking about the good that this technology and their consciousness would contribute to the health and well-being of their pets, of the wildlife in their yard, of the plants that are in their vicinity? In other words, if you really start thinking about the full spectrum of these potential effects, and we think that people are now becoming mindful of this, and they're saying, that's the kind of human I want to be. I want to be the more forgiving. I want to be the more being able to shift from negative to positive. I want to be the more peaceful. I want to be all those higher consciousness values. I think it doesn't take a rocket scientist to envision what the consequences might be for virtually every aspect of human nature, of human endeavor. In principle, that's a possibility.
Well, Doc, may I share with you that in our microcosm, in our core community, that we have a platform where our core community communicates and where we do shows together and answers and questions and all that. And I would say that the majority has made the kinds of decisions that you just talked about, and also uses the FLFE service. What we have observed in all of us, and I include my wife and myself, what we have observed in all of us are these kinds of life changes and improvements and sort of up levelings. And to me, to see that, of course, this is all empirical, this is clearly, but there's some data Clayton has actually measured. And so the average the average rise in consciousness was 40 points over the span of a year, which is incredible. So we have some really strong experiences around this that make us very positive. Now, I would love to extend already an invitation to a second conversation. There's so much more to unpack, and your work is so deep. And I do want to pick your brain and even put you on the spot with some of those questions some more. before today, I would love, because you are a skeptic. As a scientist, you have to be. And from that perspective, what would you say to someone who's on the fence and says, "Hey, I've heard about this stuff. I've heard about this FLFE, and it kind of makes sense, but I'm also skeptical." How would you advise them to approach whether or not they should give it a try, and how they should even approach a trial, for example?
Wow, that's a great question. Again, no one has asked me that question in quite that way. And you deserve to have the opportunity to put me on the spot. I'm just telling you that if you want to do that for the greater good for your community, I am privileged to be on the hot seat. Okay,
Thank you, sir. And that is the only intention here.
I sense that. I would say first of all that if the person is genuinely curious, that the first thing that they really grok is that this is a company that gives you a 15-day free trial and doesn't ask for any information about you. It doesn't ask for, I mean, they don't ask for like a credit
Credit
card
card
or whatever.
or
So,
anything. Yeah.
or anything. They just have your email address, I presume, when they're in contact with you. So consequently, there is no risk. There's no cost. There's no, it's not like you have to go and argue with some person to get your credit card or your money back. There's, quote, no risk.
Hmm.
That's number one. Number two, I would say that if you're genuinely wanting to know whether there's something real here, and data matters to you, then I would strongly encourage you to go and explore their research pages and just click on various experiments that interest you to see the kinds of questions that are asked, because FLFE is devoted to not it's devoted to understanding and to science. Yes, it would love to grow, and yes, it would love to be able to have this service be available to as many people as can come to appreciate it, clearly. But its number one goal is to help people find whether this is something that is helpful for them so they can improve their lives and the lives of their family. So approach it with an open mind to the idea that this is not a charlatan or sham organization. And therefore, it's safe to experience it. And then finally, I would say, feel free to experience some even strange things. Allow yourself to be open to the possibility that you yourself might experience something that you didn't anticipate and maybe nobody else has anticipated. Because as you know, I'm in the same boat that you are, which is that in fact, I didn't even start trying FLFE until after this research I told you about was already known. And then it was an accident that I ended up having it be on, not knowing, or at least remembering that it was on, and then experiencing um, a positive consequence that I never expected for dealing with a long-standing pain of an injury I had when I was a professor at Yale, and it was just so out of the question.
Well, that is a beautiful invitation, and I assume that when and if that becomes sort of applicable, that FLFE will probably ask the question of their clients and customers whether they want to participate. Is that correct? I assume you're working on new studies.
Oh, of course, but certain groups have certain special areas where they are focused. Okay, you pick the word inspired, and that is a very powerful word. I should tell you that for 10 years I was the corporate director of development of energy healing at a place called Canyon Ranch, which I used to joke and call it the Harvard of health spas, and it was founded in Tucson. And I had the privilege of working directly with the CEO. And I would give lectures each week on energy healing and survival of consciousness. I would give workshops in that area. And their environment provided certain opportunities for certain questions to be asked. Because now I remember what it was. The person who was my colleague at Canyon Ranch at that time was a man by the name of Jonathan Ellerby, Dr. Jonathan Ellerby. And he published a book called The Inspiration Deficit Disorder. I'm not sure if you've seen that book, but it was a very meaningful book to me because he was recognizing how important the experience of inspiration is for us to live full and fulfilled lives. And you address that with your community. So the reason why I'm sharing this with you is that I could envision someday maybe doing something with FLFE that focused on inspiration and the promotion of inspiration and how FLFE can contribute to the experience of inspiration.
That is actually a wonderful vision, and we'd love to be a part of it when that becomes a reality. We're absolutely on board. Dr. Schwartz, I want to thank you personally for my own journey today. In this little under an hour and a half, my own mind was expanded, and I just love the way that you think. It's such an honor to be here observing your thought processes and the commitment, the honoring of the truth. I mean, in a way that has become very rare and needs to make a comeback. And it's something I would love to talk to you more about in the future, what that really means. I mean, the subtitle of this book, Extraordinary Claims Require Extraordinary Evidence, is the science and ethics of truth seeking and truth abuse. And this is almost a sacred approach. It is a sacred approach. So I just want to thank you for all the wisdom and knowledge you shared today, and for accepting another round of grilling, so to speak, in the future. A great honor, sir. Thank you.
Ditto for me. Thank you.
And Inspire Tribe, we love that you were part of this journey and conversation today, energetically, in spirit, and with minds and brains. As always, I would encourage you to, click on that link in the description, feel your way through it. And if you are inspired, give it a try. FLFE is truly something amazing. And as Dr. Schwartz said, it is of no risk to you. There's no payment required. And you can just try it for 15 days with your family and see what it does. We love you. We appreciate you. And we will be back with you again very, very soon. Today, I'd love to invite you to experience something incredible that completely changed our lives, and I trust it will do the exact same for you. Now, maybe you have visited a place or walked into a house and just felt an incredible energy, just peace, love, harmony, and you keep returning to those places because they feel so good. Such places exist in nature. Maybe you've heard of them, Machu Picchu or Mount Shasta or other places that are considered to be high consciousness fields. It is where the level of consciousness is literally higher than everywhere else, and people go there to heal, to have spiritual experiences, to meditate, to feel more peace and harmony. Now, our friends over at FLFE, Jeffrey Stegman and Clayton Stedman, have developed a spiritual quantum technology that creates such a high consciousness field around your home or on the go with their mobile service. It is a non-invasive, non-AI technology. There are no downloads or devices that you need. The technology works with quantum entanglement. The results are absolutely amazing. My wife Kristin and I did their free trial, and we were just blown away by the energy, the better sleep, the better harmony, and especially the EMF mitigation. This absolutely mitigates those effects and creates this field of unconditional love right where you are. I could talk about this all day long, but here's what I think you should do. Click the button down below that says start my free trial and simply experience it for yourself. 15 days, no credit card needed, no strings attached. Trust me, you will love it.